Okay, now that I figured out how to turn off the mute button, we can get started. Sorry about that. ERP failure rates are still 70 to 80% over the years, despite advances in technology and despite years and decades of lessons. It's still hovering in that 70 to 80% range. But why do ERP projects fail? That's what we're going to talk about today in today's live discussion. Thanks for joining today. My name is 𝗥𝗘𝗔𝗦𝗢𝗡𝗦. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent and tech-agnostic consulting company that helps clients throughout the world with their digital transformations. And much of the work we do with our clients is project recovery, helping clients clean up their failures, help them get the projects back on track. In even more extreme cases, in some cases, we're involved in litigation, expert witness litigation. So we'll help analyze some of the world's highest profiles and biggest failures and lawsuits. And there's been a ton of lessons that we've gathered over the years from those lessons and lawsuits. So really excited to have the conversation here today because I think this is something that is uncomfortable for many to talk about. A lot of people don't want to talk about failure. A lot of people would prefer to talk about the resounding successes and how great everything looked on the other side. But by understanding the failure points and what causes these failures and these metrics that have not budged since the inception of the ERP software industry, that's the only way we're going to get better. And that's the only way we're going to make our own projects successful. So that's why we focus on this topic here today, because it's a very important one. And today we're not here to blame software. So I'm not here to have a conversation about blaming software. I want to talk about why do smart organizations and smart people and people with, in many cases, decades of experience, why do they keep making the same mistakes that lead to failure? And that's ultimately what we want to talk about here today. And I'm going to go through some of my top 10 list and some of my thoughts on the top 10 reasons why transformations fail. But I really would love to hear from you, the audience, here on this topic. Before we jump in, though, I've got two questions for you. First of all, which city and country are you joining from today? So wherever you're joining or watching here today, thank you for being here. We're streaming to YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, X, and TikTok. So thank you, whichever platform you're watching. I'd love to hear from you, though. Where are you joining from? Love to get this global perspective from you. So drop in the chat if you don't mind where you're joining from. And my second question for you, as we get going here, is why do you think digital transformations and ERP projects fail? Love to hear your thoughts on that. So just drop in the chat what you think the biggest cause of failure is. If you had to pick one thing that leads to failure, and I know this is difficult. It's an unfair question because you could probably all name 10, 20, 30 different reasons why these projects run into trouble and what some of the challenges are. So I'd love to hear your feedback. What's that one thing you think is the biggest issue in your mind on why these projects fail? Drop it in the chat if you don't mind. I'd love to see what you think, and we'll pull up some of those comments for conversation as well. So getting back to just framing the conversation here, I'd love to also understand from during this conversation if you think ERP failure is inevitable or preventable with the right leadership. And I think, in my opinion, a lot of failure points come from lack of leadership. And I know, I don't want to blame customers or unfairly blame customers for their own failures. I also don't want to unfairly blame software vendors and big system integrators for some of these failures. It takes two parties and it takes multiple parties and plenty of blame to go around for these projects to transpire in a negative way. But I do think at the end of the day, organizations that go through implementations have to take responsibility for the project, and they have to take ownership and governance for the project. And I think that's a big part of where the problems stem from, is a lack of leadership, a lack of clarity, and a lack of alignment at the top. And when you don't have that clarity and alignment at the top, what ends up happening is something's going to fill that void. That lack of leadership is going to get filled by a void somewhere, somehow. And as we'll get into the conversation here today, and as we'll discuss, what will happen is people will make their own personal decisions that's in their own self-interest, the best self-interest, to fill that void. When there's a lack of leadership, it'll get replaced by self-interest. And oftentimes, whether it's internal employees and their own self-interest or external consultants and third parties, vendors, system integrators and their self-interest, someone's going to step in and fill that void when there's a lack of leadership. So in my opinion, I think a lot of this stems from leadership. And so a lot of this conversation and a lot of this discussion is aimed for leaders, because I think a lot of what we'll talk about here today are things that are completely within your control And there are things you can do today. There are things you can do right now actively in your digital transformation and ERP projects failures or ERP projects in general before they turn to failures to get those projects on track or to keep them on track before they get too far out of hand. Now, one thing that we've just recently published is an ERP project recovery guide. It's a guide you can download on our website. Just scan that QR code right here on the screen. I'll also drop it in the comments below. But it's a guide on how to get a project back on track. So even if you're not what you would call a classic failure, you might be experiencing some challenges or difficulties or pain points, and you're trying to figure out how to get the project back on track, how to right size it, how to just pivot, redirect, get things under control. This is a guide that will help you do that. So be sure to scan that QR code and check out that guide for your learning pleasure and for your execution pleasure as well. So just a couple comments here on YouTube. There's a comment, they can hear me now that I figured out how to undo the mute button, rookie mistake. So thanks for bearing with me in the first few seconds of this stream. The comment is, can hear you now. Awesome topic. Looking forward to 2026. And then software attorney Marcus Harris on YouTube says, trying to make the new system act like the old system and unreasonable expectations are his reason or top reason why digital transformations fail. And I totally agree with both points, especially that unrealistic expectations one. That's one we'll come back to for quite a bit of discussion, because a lot of times problems that happen during these projects, they stem from not fully understanding what it is going to take to get the project right. So you end up believing in false expectations that oftentimes are set by software vendors and system integrators, where they convince you that if in a perfect world, if you do all these things perfectly, you could possibly maybe implement a system really fast and really cheap. And then you end up setting the line in the sand, setting expectations internally with your management team, with your leadership. You end up setting these unrealistic expectations that never fully materialize. And then you end up having to make bad decisions later because now you don't have the budget or the plan or the time or the resources to invest in the project to make it successful. So those unrealistic expectations, I totally agree with. I think that's a very common reason why these projects fail. But I'd love, again, to hear from more of you in the chat here. What are your thoughts? What do you think the number one reason for failure is? What would you pick as that one root cause, that one biggest thing that if you're going to tell someone, hey, just do this one thing and avoid doing this one thing, and you will be more likely to be successful? Would love to hear your thoughts in the chat there. So I don't want to talk about theory today. We're going to talk about what actually goes on in real projects. We are going to get into some case studies and discussions around what experience we've seen with some of our projects in terms of especially the project recoveries and the expert witness litigation support type of work we've done, because sometimes those are the best case studies to learn from. So we will talk about that. And I guess a question I have for the audience too, just to keep the conversation going, is should executives be held personally accountable for ERP failures? A lot of times, in my opinion, a lot of times executives will try to bring in experts that know the software better than anyone, and they've been through these projects before. And that's understandable. That's what you need. You need that outside expertise. You need the software vendors. You need the system integrator to build and configure the software. But there's a fine line between bringing in experts and learning from and getting advice from experts and completely abdicating responsibility. And I think too many companies cross that line of abdicating responsibility and just assuming that the experts have it under control. The experts are telling me what sounds too good to be true, or they're telling me what I want to hear, and I'm going to believe that. I'm going to believe that they can handle this whole thing, and it's not going to be as bad as, it's not going to be as bad as some may think. And they've got their methodology, they've got their best practices, they've got their awesome software that's going to make everything be okay. And that's where leaders have to take more of a trust but verify approach. But I'd love to hear from you. What kind of leadership issues or challenges have you seen, or how do you think, or do you think leadership or lack thereof can affect these sorts of projects? And a lot of times ERP failure, when it comes to executive ownership, and by the way, we're getting into the top 10, my top 10 list here. And one of the things on my top 10 list here of the top 10 reasons why these projects fail is lack of executive ownership. So, as we dive into this here, this whole concept of executive ownership and leadership, it's a very broad topic, very big topic, very relevant topic, and very important. But as we get into this, though, and as we unpack this and peel back the onion and understanding this aspect of what causes these failure as it relates to leadership and lack of executive ownership. One of the questions I have for you, and just food for thought, is ERP failure more often caused by bad decisions or no decisions? Because a lot of times what happens in these projects is the reasons they get delayed is because decisions slow down. So in other words, a vendor might be able to configure the product today. Literally today, they could be building software to support your business if they knew what it was you needed, and if they knew how your business processes should look, and if they knew what your priorities were as an organization. But that's a big if. And when an organization doesn't fully understand what their future state is, and they don't have a clear vision for the project or clarity around what it is they're trying to accomplish, what the goals and objectives and the business value and the business drivers are, if those things aren't understood and clearly articulated by leadership to the rest of the organization, it causes a lot of confusion in these projects. And it may not seem relevant at the time. It may not seem like confusion at the time. But when I say confusion, I don't mean people just throw their arms up in the air and they don't know what to do. I mean, they have trouble making decisions because people disagree or don't have clarity on how to make that decision. So for example, if we know that we could be using technology to completely overhaul one of our workflows, who's going to make that decision? I mean, who's going to decide that, yes, that will work for our business? Who's going to decide that, yes, that is important enough that we're going to go through the pain of changing our processes and our people to support or to enable that new business process, that new technology? You've got the software vendor over here who's ready to build it. They can give you that technology. But over here, you've got the client and the team who has to make the decision of what they want their workflow to look like, whether or not they want certain features or functions. And what ends up happening is people don't know how to make that decision because in many cases, you have competing priorities or competing conflicting messages of how to make that decision. So you might have the vendor over here saying, hey, this is best practice. This is industry standard. This is how the software works, whatever. They're telling you how great the software is. And then over here, within your own team, you've got people saying, hey, that seems a little scary, or that process isn't going to work. Here's why it won't work. Or we like our old way better, or whatever. You could have a million different reasons internally why people don't want to necessarily go along with the change. So you've got this project team and these group of decision makers are stuck in the middle and they don't know how to make that decision. And oftentimes what happens is they're going to go with the path of least resistance, which in some cases is, let's just pave the cow paths. Let's just leave things the way they are today. Let's give our people what they may want, which is to not change. Let's leave it, let's go back to our legacy process and try to rebuild that within the new software. Or what ends up happening oftentimes is the software vendor will say, no, this is best practice. This is standard off the shelf functionality. And the project team says, okay, let's just go ahead and jam that, cram that down the throats of our organization without necessarily understanding what the impacts are, and without necessarily knowing how to manage that change and how to address the resistance and pushback that will likely come from that. So you can see how a project team might get caught in the middle there, especially when they don't have that clarity of how to make decisions like that. And oftentimes what happens is not only is the decision flawed or simply following the path of least resistance, oftentimes what happens is it also takes a long time to get to that decision. So that slows the project down because now the vendor's waiting for you to decide, you, the client, to decide how your processes should look and what inputs they need in order to build the software. So that ends up pushing the project out. It's that decision making, that slow decision making that oftentimes delays these projects. There's a study that I love to quote. It's a study from an organization called the Standish Group, and it's an analyst firm. I think it's a global analyst firm. And there's a professor in particular named Hans Mulder from the University of Antwerp in Europe. And he is part of the Standish Group as well, and he's part of the research behind this. I think it's called the Chaos Report, if I remember correctly. It's called the Chaos Report. It's a study of, I think it's about 30,000 ERP projects over decades that they've been tracking this data, different case studies around ERP projects and digital transformations. And in that study, they said that the number one reason why projects fail, or I should back up and say the number one reason why projects take longer than expected and cost more than expected, is because of decision latency. And they attribute, I think it's 92% of the problems in digital transformation trace back to decision latency. So in other words, it's because companies can't make decisions fast enough. The speed of decision making is too slow to support a project plan. Now, I would argue that project plans should always have buffer in there, or should have tasks within an overall plan to accommodate decision making, because you do have to make decisions, and you can't expect that someone's going to, within a workshop setting, decide on the fly, yes, that's the way we want our business to work. A lot of times you have other stakeholders you have to inform, you have to consult with, you want to get feedback from others. A lot of times the right experts aren't in the room when you're doing these workshops, when you're defining your future state or whatever the case may be. So to make immediate decisions is not realistic to begin with, but you also don't want decision making to take so long that it ends up unnecessarily elongating the project plan and extending the budget. But there's a fine line, there's a balance. And I think, again, going back to leadership and clarity of vision and priorities and goals and business drivers, if that stuff is clearly defined, it's going to be easier to make decisions faster. And so I think the combination of being able to make decisions not immediately, but faster than you would otherwise, that can speed up a project. But that all starts with upfront clarity and leadership, and strong leadership throughout the project. So, and then back to software attorney Marcus Harris, back to his point around realistic expectations. Part of realistic expectations is looking at a vendor's plan and assuming, and this is a very safe assumption, by the way, the very safe assumption to make is when you get a proposal from a software vendor and or a system integrator, it is very, very extremely safe to assume that that is unrealistic. That the plan you get from a vendor is incomplete and unrealistic. Not because they necessarily want to mislead you, not because they're necessarily lying, but because they are assuming a set of assumptions that are ideal. And most organizations are operating in much less than ideal scenarios or situations. And so you have to assume that it is going to take you some time to make decisions. You're going to have to work through the messiness of defining this future state and getting through some of these made. So all important stuff, but a lot of that traces back to leadership, executive alignment, ownership. It comes back to the top of the organization in many cases. So I want to go back to some of the comments here that we're getting here, and thank you for all the comments we've gotten here. And again, the question at hand, I have a two-part question at hand. If you haven't answered this question yet, this is your homework. Tell me what city and country you're joining from, and tell me what you think the number one cause of ERP and digital transformation failures. If you had to pick one thing, what would that one thing be that you think is the biggest reason why they fail? So this comment is from 𝗙𝗥𝗘𝗦𝗢𝗥𝗠𝗦 on YouTube. Says ERP technology is pushing at such a speed that the landscape is expanding faster than internal skills. Lack of competent project champion internal is another reason why projects fail. Really good points, especially that first one. The speed of change of technology is something that can't be overlooked. Technology is changing far too fast for organizations to think that it's going to be easy. It's changing far too fast to think that it's not going to be disruptive in the short term, at least, to their business, to their people and their operations. Think of it as a chasm that's growing. I mean, your business is here. Let's imagine a little graphic where your business is changing like this. You're trucking along. You're pivoting. You're evolving. You're changing, doing fine, right? It's working. But then technology is more of a hockey stick. I mean, it's more of just a massive quantum leap amount of change, and that divergence between organizational ability to change and technological change is growing. And so my argument and my view of this is that change is becoming more impactful over time, and it's not going to get better. It's going to continue getting more and more impactful because technology is on that hockey stick, that exponential growth rate right now. And it's just simply impossible for any organization of any meaningful size to change as fast as technology is changing. And so that's just the reality. And that is not an indictment on customers. It's not an indictment on the average business in the world. That's the reality. I mean, businesses, they're a large organization, and especially a larger organization, is just going to change slower than technology. So we have to recognize that gap is growing, and the impact is getting more and more significant over time. So that's a great point, and thank you for that. Another follow-up comment from the same person on YouTube says, most CTOs approach ERP implementations as an IT project. And this person, by the way, is joining from beautiful Cape Town, South Africa. That is for sure one of my favorite parts of the world, not only South Africa, but Cape Town in particular is beautiful, that whole region. So thank you for joining from Cape Town today. And I agree. And that is actually one of the things that are on my top 10 list, by the way, is treating an ERP project as an IT project rather than a true business transformation or a business initiative. So the more you treat this project as an IT upgrade that we have to do because our vendor has sunset the legacy product or because our current system is not working, so we just have to do something, that's an okay reason. That is a reason. I'm not saying that's not reality. That could be a very good reason why you're implementing technology, but you have to have a much bigger reason than that. And even if it means you have to force yourself to articulate, what does this really mean? We know we have to do this, right? Vendors sunsetting the product. Our old homegrown system is garbage, or it worked for a while, but it's garbage now because we've outgrown it and it's not going to help us scale. Those are very valid reasons. I'm not being dismissive of that, but for an organization to truly survive change successfully, they have to have a lot more clarity than that in terms of what the actual what the project's going to be, and making sure that it's more of a business initiative and more business aligned rather than just simply focusing on the technological aspects of the project. Some more comments here. Another one from YouTube from 𝗥𝗘𝗔𝗦𝗢𝗥𝗠𝗦 on YouTube says accountability is oftentimes blurred when it comes to leadership. Very good point. You need to have clear roles and responsibilities, clear sponsorship, clear business process owners, and clear decision makers in all these different areas of a project. So that's a great point. Another comment coming in from YouTube is amongst small and mid-sized enterprises to larger organizations, a lack of documented processes. Most are held within the organizational collective memory, or most are held within the organizational collective memory. So that's a great point. A lot of tribal knowledge, a lot of people that have it in their heads, understanding how the business works today, and maybe having this tribal knowledge that is not documented anywhere, and getting that out of people's heads and understanding the true reality of how business is really working is something that's very, very challenging and difficult for organizations when you have this much tribal knowledge that's not documented anywhere. But yet you need that information and that documentation and that knowledge to be able to address that. So I just realized I'm having a technical issue with the chat from LinkedIn. I was wondering why I was getting so many comments from YouTube and not many on LinkedIn, when usually it's the opposite. Usually I get more on LinkedIn. So I just realized I'm not getting the comments through the chat. So I'm not going to be able to show the comments, but I will read a few of them here that are great comments. I always tend to get good ones from LinkedIn. So thank you for all of you joining on LinkedIn. Hello. Thanks for being here. Couple questions. Aaron on LinkedIn says, yes, they should. And that was in response, I believe, in response to my question of, should leaders be more responsible? Should leaders and executives take more ownership and responsibility for their own ERP and digital transformation projects? Aaron says, yes, they should. Another comment on LinkedIn. This is from Andrew on LinkedIn. He says, don't allow scope creep, or at a bare minimum, manage it at the leadership level. That's a great point too. And you make a really, really good point at the end of that question, where you say, at a bare minimum, manage it at the leadership level. That's a really good point, because a lot of times leaders don't think they need to be responsible for scope creep. They think, well, that's what the project manager should do. That's what the project team is here for. That's what the vendor is for, is to help manage scope creep. You're going to have pressure to increase scope or to change scope during the project, because no matter how well you plan and how well you prepare, there's a certain things you don't know. You don't know what you don't know when you go into these projects in many cases. And so scope is going to need to be somewhat flexible as you go through a project, but you need someone who has tight governance and who's deliberately deciding what is or isn't appropriate in terms of potential changes to that scope. And so I think that needs to be something that gets escalated to the leadership level. And a lot of times leaders don't want to deal with it. It's like, hey, we're getting too techno talk here. Or we're talking about configurations, or we're talking about customizations, and extensions, and integrations, and things that I just don't know a lot about, or that's below the surface of what a leader should be focused on. But you absolutely should be, because these are all things that affect your business. It affects the time. It affects the risk profile of the project. These are all things that leaders just need to do a better job in general of rolling up their sleeves and taking more ownership and responsibility for these things. And that's a hard message to deliver. Sometimes that's a hard message to deliver to our clients, because the answer that most of us would want to hear if we were in leadership positions is we want to hear that someone's going to handle it for us, and don't worry, everything's going to be fine. That's the message we want to hear. That's the positive optimism, the safe answer. I don't necessarily want someone telling me that this is going to be difficult. You're going to have to work harder than you think. You're going to have to roll up your sleeves more than you want. And we're going to need to give you a little pep talk to be able to do more of that. That's not necessarily what leaders want to hear, what anyone would want to hear. And we're all human, and I understand that. But it is the hard, brutal reality is that leaders do have to take ownership and make decisions around things like scope creep in order to keep these projects on track. So thank you for that comment, Andrew. Aaron on LinkedIn says executive sponsor is fired. That's bad news for the project. I'm not sure if, Aaron, you're speaking to your current situation. If you are, I'm sorry. That must be very stressful. And if you haven't been in that situation before, if any of you have been in that situation before, that's very difficult news, especially when no one person is going to make or break a project like this. But unfortunately, I've seen plenty of times in my career as well. You see one person who, right or wrong or fair or unfair, gets blamed for these projects, and in many cases they do end up getting fired over it. Ilgar on LinkedIn says a lack of staff training is a root cause for transformation failure. So thank you for that. I do agree. I think that is in my top 10 for sure. Anything to do with change management is going to be in my top 10. Ingemar on LinkedIn says many senior executives are fearful of an ERP transformation due to past experiences or news stories of failures in the market, especially in the industry they serve. It's so important for them to understand the importance of mitigating risk and relying on their gut instincts, focus on change management to ensure an outcome that is successful. So that is a really good point. And I think executives are fearful of transformations in ERP projects, but again, in the midst of that fear, against that backdrop of fear, what ends up happening is people overcorrect by latching on to a lifeboat of hope that they get. So again, it's we as humans we can't operate out of fear. We can't make decisions out of fear all the time. That's a bad spot to be in our brains and clarity of decision making. But what ends up happening is that when I hear something that gives me hope that sounds good, it's that easy answer that I'm looking for, I'm going to latch onto that because that sounds a lot better than these stories that Crazy Eric on YouTube and LinkedIn is talking about over here. That sounds like something I don't want to think about. It's too much for me to digest. So I'm going to opt into a more optimistic scenario. And that's a dangerous spot to be in, because what ends up happening again is it fills a void. You search for answers that fill that void. And even if it's not based in any sort of reality, which is usually not, I'm going to latch on to the answer that sounds good, that easy button, that silver bullet, that magic silver bullet that's going to solve that problem and get rid of that fear for me. I might fall for things like that unrealistic project plan from the vendor, that system integrator who tells me not to worry, they're going to handle it all, they've got it all figured out. That software vendor that says we have best practices. You don't need to worry about your current state and your business processes and whether or not this project is going to be successful because we have industry standard best practices in our software. So that fear, I think, is a good point, because it does lead to some bad decisions and some decisions that are overly optimistic to counter that fear. And part of the reason why I talk about failures a lot is because I think there's so much you can learn from software failures, but also, if I'm being candid, I think a lot of leaders need to be scared more than they are going into these projects. I'm not saying operate and make decisions out of fear, but you do need to have a little bit of uncertainty, a little bit of paranoia. I know Steve Jobs used to talk about how, as a leader, you need to have a certain amount of paranoia. You need to be paranoid about your competitors and about the health of your company and the health of the big change initiative. I think it applies in these projects as well. You need to be a little bit paranoid and ask yourself, what am I missing? What could go wrong? What are those risks and blind spots that I have? There's something I don't know here, and let me dig into it and understand. And I think if you have just enough fear to where you know that you need to run everything through the lens of reality and gut check, then I think that's a healthy dose of fear. You obviously don't want to be so panicked that you do nothing or that you're just paralyzed and can't make decisions effectively, but you do want enough fear that you are having a certain amount of healthy paranoia, if you want to call it that. And I can't remember what Steve Jobs called it. I think he did call it healthy paranoia, if I remember correctly. But correct me in the chat if anyone remembers that quote I'm talking about from Steve Jobs. Here's a comment from Patrick on LinkedIn. It says, the people who understand the problem oftentimes don't have the authority to make the decision, while those with the authority to make the decision don't always understand. That's super interesting. Really good point. And I love the way you frame that. And it's very true, by the way. I totally agree with this. I've never actually framed it this exact concise way, but I think it's a great point. I'll read it again just for those that might have missed it. The people who understand the problem often don't have the authority to make the decision, while those with the authority to make the decision don't always understand. And that's great because, it comes back to this leadership dilemma that I'm talking about. Is leaders oftentimes don't understand what the real issues are or what the real processes are. They oftentimes don't understand the realities of the front lines of how the business is working. And that's understandable because leaders have worked their way up the organization and they're just at a certain level where they don't know every single detail of what's happening throughout the organization, not like the frontline people anyway. Unfortunately, those are the same people, though, that need to make decisions. I'm sitting here saying they need to be involved in the decisions. They have to be the ones to take ownership and provide that direction at an executive level. But at the same time, I'm acknowledging that they don't always have the answers and they don't always understand, which is why these projects are so tricky, because you need the input and the feedback from people that actually do understand, but you also need the people up at the higher levels to make decisions around these projects to keep it on track and to give it clarity and direction. So you've got to have both. You've got to have people that understand the problems, that can speak to the way things are today, the way things are working well today, the way things aren't working well today. And that's going to help, by the way, from a buy-in and change management perspective in the long term, because now you're involving the front lines rather than just forcing the change on them. And at the same time, you need to have those leaders, though, that can make decisions and provide clarity at times of uncertainty and at times of when there's lack of clarity. So great point. Thank you for that, Patrick. Another comment here from Ingemar, dialing in or calling in from Grand Rapids, Michigan. My wife is from near there, so thanks for joining from Michigan. She's from Lansing, though, not Grand Rapids. My view is senior executives don't buy into the necessary time and change management required for the team to be successful. This is seen where core team members do not have enough time to dedicate to the project, leading to poor planning and execution. So great point there. Totally agree with that. Ona on LinkedIn says, misalignment on and importance of stabilization period is part of the journey. So I agree. Ensuring that there's alignment internally, that you're going to have stabilization, that things aren't going to be perfect. You're not going to go live and flip the switch and everything's fine. You are going to have challenges and opportunities for optimization for sure. What I think the problem with that, though, and where I would add a caveat to what you're saying, Ona, is yes, you should expect stabilization and you should have realistic expectations around that. But I'd also say that you don't want to be so comfortable with chaos and disruption that you defer a lot of critical things to after go live. I can't tell you how many times I've heard a software vendor say, oh, don't worry about that, we'll deal with that after go live, or don't worry about that, we'll deal with that in stabilization. Those are scary words to me. Like when I hear those words, I think, okay, hold on. Anything you say, let's just deal with that after go live, I have to ask myself, okay, you've punted the problem out of the project. So we've got this time box, this budget box we're operating in. So you've punted a problem out of there to help us accomplish that. But have you just thrown a grenade over there at go live to where things are going to be so disruptive and such a mess that we're going to pay exponentially more for it later, rather than let's just get it right now. And yes, that might mean that the project is going to extend beyond the budget or the timeline. But that's one thing I don't think we should be as afraid of as we are. And I don't want to say, forget project governance, forget project discipline, because you do have to manage the time, you do have to manage the budget, but you have to also know, and this is an art more than a science, you have to know when it's okay to invest a little bit more time and money here, even if it means we're going to disappoint some people because now we're extending the timeline of the budget. If we do that in the name of fixing a huge problem over on the other side of go live, then yes, let's do that, because it's going to be a lot cheaper to do that than to try and fix it later. And unfortunately, most consultants and vendors and system integrators are long gone to ever see the damage and the collateral damage that's been caused by those decisions to punt after go live. They go away and think everything is fine. Look, we finished on time, on budget. We delivered a working product. That is a success. Whereas a lot of times we come into these projects after the fact and say, this is not a success. This is a train wreck. This is a disaster. But yet though that same project in the eyes of a consultant or vendor that was involved in the implementation might be, no, it was successful. We finished on time, on budget. The software worked. Well, you also punted 100 different problems post go live, and now they've turned to grenades, and now they're blowing up in our face, and we've got to fix them. So I think having that clarity is really important. So I agree. You want to have misaligned, or you want to be aligned on the importance of stabilization. But you also want to be realistic about what it is too. Tom Weeks on LinkedIn says the true cost of the organization is often underestimated. The resources, time, money, and personnel is often understated, as well as disruptive cost of the organizational processes. The organization needs to be realistic in the challenges as endeavors of this size will require, and commit to it. That's a great point. Thank you for that, Tom. Maria on LinkedIn says business client selecting the wrong business representatives to manage process changes and working in silos. In addition, consultants not having enough expertise to challenge narrow-minded business decisions on design. This creates delays and rework. Really good points, Maria. And what's funny, hopefully you all take this in a joking way. I'm not being critical because I have the same problem. But I love when I ask a question, pick one thing, and it's so hard for people to pick one thing, and myself included. I cannot pick one reason why these projects fail. So to be fair, I would struggle with this answer too, but it is funny to see in the chat, like, oh, there's one big thing, but it's also this, and that. And I think that's actually a symbolic or representative of what these projects are all about, is because it is hard to pick one thing, and it's a system thing. It's a systematic thing you've got to do. You've got to solve and put together this entire system of governance and expectations and leadership, change management. All this stuff all has to fit together. And any one piece missing can oftentimes derail the entire thing, and that's what makes it hard to pick one thing. Now we're getting a lot of comments here, so this is great. Thank you for that. Another comment here from YouTube. In the midst of a transformation now, so many choices and processes have been forever undefined, and nobody will define them. So I just started defining them, and 80% of them stick. So that's interesting. Yeah, and someone's got to make that decision of what the processes are and what the decisions behind them are. Caveat to that would be, if you can get the people that own the processes to make those decisions, that's ideal. Oftentimes they may not know enough to make the decision, in which case the decision sometimes can or should be made for them. A lot of this comes down to culture too. It comes down to the type of organization you're in, but that's good feedback. Thank you for that. There's a comment, another comment from YouTube. In my experience in HR and payroll outsourcing, one factor is a certain level of secrecy of the program before it's deployed, which later lowers the engagement level of the team that will implement it. Great point. And this goes back to the decision process too. You know, which software are we going to implement? Which system integrator are we going to use? What's the timeline and budget? What's the vision for the project? The goals and objectives, all that stuff. A lot of times it gets made behind closed doors and then rolled out to the organization. But oftentimes it gets perceived as being forced down the organization because not enough people, not enough of the right stakeholders and decision makers were involved in some of that decision making. So really good point, and relevant point for sure. Another comment on YouTube. It's often overlooked roadblock to smooth change management. I understand the delicacy of the topic. Outsourcing might bring layoffs, but you want to have an engaged team to adapt business processes. And so in most cases, and this is probably a biased comment just based on the fact that we do so much in terms of just broader digital transformations and ERP projects for our clients. And most of them are in growth mode. And so in most cases, they're implementing ERP and technology to not necessarily reduce staff, but just to make them more efficient and maybe hire less people in the long term. But we're not doing big outsourcing projects like it sounds like this person might be. It's the same person, by the way, that said they do HR and payroll outsourcing. Outsourcing, I understand, is a different animal, and that does typically oftentimes lead to reduced headcount. So it might be a little bit a different experience that you and I both have on that front. So it's interesting. I imagine you probably see that a lot more than I do, and more than our team does. That the layoff dynamic there. Again, one more reminder. If you're just joining us, we're talking about ERP project recovery or ERP project failures, the root causes. I also want to share with you this ERP recovery guide that you can download. Just scan this QR code on the screen. I'll drop it in the chat as well. It's a free resource for you to check out if you'd like to learn more about how to get your project back on track. A couple other comments on YouTube. One from Prakash I'm sorry, not on YouTube, on LinkedIn. Prakash on LinkedIn says, focusing only on urgent work and neglecting important design tasks is risky. Pause and assess how much time are you wasting on quick fixes and adjust your plan to prioritize important tasks. This is super interesting. This is a really cool, really good sort of micro. It's a micro example. It sounds like a small thing, but there are hundreds of these things in your project, most likely. And that is, how many times are you just putting out fires? You're just responding to the vendor who said, I need this, and that. And in fact, I'll tell a quick story about this. I was at a client last week going through a big SAP S/4HANA implementation. And one of the comments the CIO made, we were at dinner together, and she was saying that, we're having trouble just keeping up with the vendor. The vendor, so just to back up, third stages in there, we're providing PMO type support and work. We're doing some change management. We're doing some data and integration type work. So we're doing a lot of different work in different work streams to support this client through their SAP project. But they have the SAP system integrator who's doing the real technical stuff, the configuration, the design and build of the software. And so, this is a company that doesn't have experience with SAP. They don't have a lot of people on staff that know SAP. And so they're deferring to the vendor who's saying, hey, in order for us to build S/4HANA, we need A, B, and C, and we need this by tomorrow or by next week or whatever it is. And so she's talking about how there's this reactive nature to the project team internally, because they're reacting to the vendor who just will spring on them. Hey, here's what I need, and I need it by 3-4 days from now, whatever it is. And so the context of the conversation that we were getting into is, how can our program management guidance, how can we funnel more of those decisions and asks and things that the vendor needs? How can we funnel that, make sure we're funneling that through the PMO that we've set up? Because it was kind of happening below the PMO level, and it was just being direct, from the SAP SI directly to the client versus, we're looking at the whole program overall, whereas the vendor's looking just at SAP, whereas we're looking at all SAP plus all the other stuff that needs to happen in these projects. So anyway, long story short, it was there's a lot of reactive nature in these projects where vendor needs this and they need it now. But it's important to step back at a more strategic level. To this person's point, to Prakash's point on LinkedIn, it's important to step back and say, are these the right things we should be doing? Should we be doing them now? Is that the right timeline? Are we rushing that decision? Those are all questions that need to be asked. And there's so much work to do in these projects that it gets really easy to get in this reactive nature of execution without stopping to ask why. So those are some really good points that you all bring up. So thank you for that, Prakash. One of the things that I want to bring up too is the question of, at what point does partnering with an outside vendor turn into outsourcing leadership? And this is something that the more I get into my career, the longer I'm in this industry, the more I grow frustrated by this point. And that is, it's a twofold problem. One is, I used to think it was a vendor problem, and now I'm seeing it more as a vendor and a leadership problem. Let's start with the vendor problem. Vendors have conflicting self-interest. They want to sell software. Most services companies, system integrators, are making some sort of commission, some sort of revenue from you buying software from whatever vendor they represent. If they're an SAP partner and they're implementing SAP for you, they're not just making money on the SAP services that they provide to you. They're also making money from SAP because they help sell the project and they help sell the software. So they're making a cut of that recurring subscription revenue that SAP is getting. They're also getting a cut of that. And in some cases, I've talked to leaders of some of these system integrators whose revenue, in some cases, is greater on the software side. Their commission from software vendors, in some cases, is more revenue than they're making on the services, which you would think, services is their main business. But for many of them, that's just an ante. That's just a price of admission. That's just an entry point to generate some revenue, but the real money, the real high profit stuff comes from the commissions that they get from the software vendors. And so right there, you've got a conflict of interest. You've got a partner who is hell-bent in many cases on forcing technology into your organization, whether it belongs there or not. And yes, you may have already decided that you're deploying the software, and you may think in your mind, well, it doesn't matter because I've already decided I'm going to buy that software. It goes beyond just the initial sale. It's their job to get as many licenses, as many modules, as much of that revenue as possible for the vendor, in addition to getting as much revenue for themselves on the services side, more of their direct revenue. So right there, you've got a conflict of interest, because now the more technology they force into the organization, the longer the project takes, the more shelfware they buy, the more resources they have to throw at the project. That benefits them. But that hurts you. That's not in your best interest necessarily, to spend more money on software services. So that conflict of interest is a real problem. And I used to think, okay, well, shame on the industry, shame on this industry, and shame on the vendors for doing that. But the more I work with, as I've evolved in my career, and as I've advanced, and I deal more with executive steering committees and executive sponsors, and I deal mostly at the executive level now, I see that a lot of it is a leadership problem, because the executives sometimes either don't know enough, and it's our job to educate them and help them understand what these projects are going to entail. But a lot of times they either don't know enough, or they don't care. They don't want to know. They want someone just to take away the problem, because this is messy. I've heard about the failure rates. I've seen the failures in the news. I just want someone to take care of it for me. And I prefer it to be an expert, someone who knows the software really well, whatever. And so that leads to leaders who step back and say, okay, I'm just going to let a vendor come in and do their thing. We at Third Stage had a client probably about 2 years ago. This is a big company, a global company, another one that was implementing SAP. And we came in a little bit later. They'd already picked SAP. They'd already started the project, and they were starting to run into problems with their system integrator and with the project itself. And so they brought us in to do an assessment and help them remediate some of the challenges they were having on this S/4HANA implementation. And I remember talking to the vendor about, they were working with one of the big four consulting firms. And I was talking to the client about this, about, just the origins of the relationship, and how they got to work with this partner, and how the plan was created. Because one of the big questions we had was the plan was unrealistic. The assumptions were off. It didn't match. It didn't fit the business. I mean, it just looked it was very apparent there was a cookie cutter approach to implementation, and it didn't make sense for this business. It was a complex business. It was global. It had multiple business units, but yet the project plan and the strategy just didn't make sense, and it didn't match that. And so we start asking questions of, okay, how did this happen? Let's help figure out how we got here, so we can help figure out how to move forward. And one of the comments that came up in conversation was, well, we weren't allowed to make certain decisions. And I said, what do you mean you weren't allowed? And they said, well, the way this big four consulting firm negotiated their contract is they have ultimate decision-making authority over the project. And I was actually shocked that any company, especially a sophisticated company, which, by the way, this is a large company, like I mentioned, very, very sophisticated procurement department. And we knew that because we went through a lot of hoops to just get in a situation where we could work with them. We had to go through a lot of hoops with their procurement group. So we knew they had a fairly aggressive procurement group. And I was shocked to hear that this of all clients is this same client that had this same rigid procurement process has agreed to let this third party, this big four consulting firm, have ultimate decision-making authority. And I said, well, why did you guys agree to that? I mean, first of all, I don't know why any consulting partner would want that, because they should push that onto you. That should be a decision-making, should be the client's responsibility, in my opinion. So I didn't understand why they even asked for it in the first place. I also didn't understand why the client agreed to it. And the client said, well, they said that they wouldn't take the project unless we agreed to let them have complete control and decision-making authority. And then I asked the question, the uncomfortable question, well, why didn't you just let them walk? And they said, well, they do our audit, and they've done other work for us too. We have a good relationship with them, and we wanted to work with them. So you look at that and you say, was it shame on the big four consulting firm, or is it shame on the leaders who decided that was okay and they let the big four consulting firm act that way? I'm oftentimes critical of big four consulting firms. I used to work at one of them, so I know the inner workings and the what happens behind the curtain, and I don't like it. I don't like a lot of what happens behind the curtain at big four consulting firms. So I know how they operate, And so sometimes I'll take more of a shame on them approach, but then you also have to look at, well, who hired them? Who agreed to this? Who's allowing these firms to act the way they do? Some of these larger system integrators, and not just Big Four, but any, system integrator of any significant size, a lot of times they have pretty bad behaviors, but a lot of times it's because it was enabled by leadership. Leadership allows them to act that way. So it does get back to leadership, and I think that's a really important point as well. So great point here from the YouTube comment here. So thank you for that. So we're talking about executive ownership. I think we've covered that fairly well. One thing we have not covered that is in my top 10 list, one of the top reasons why ERP projects and digital transformations fail. This is a really important one, and that is skipping phase 0 and poor upfront strategy. And so a lot of times what we find is that the ERP projects were doomed before the implementation ever started because they didn't do the proper planning up front. They rushed into execution when they haven't aligned on strategy. And a lot of times leaders see phase 0 as an optional task that is just going to extend the timeline. And it's a nice to have if you have time, but we don't have time and we don't have the budget. So we're going to skip over phase 0. It's also hard for executives to see the immediate ROI. So that's a challenge as well, because it's hard to quantify how much time and money this is going to save you later by spending the time and money upfront on phase 0. And to illustrate the point, or maybe to give an example or a scenario that's very understandable to many of you, is if you think about how these projects typically evolve, and I'd say this is probably true 80%, 90% of the time we're working with clients during the initial digital strategy and software evaluation and selection stage. That's a big service we provide to a lot of our clients, is helping them define their roadmap, helping them pick the software or in some cases multiple technologies to support their digital transformations. And you go through this long evaluation process. You have salespeople involved from the software vendor and the system integrators. So you've got a lot of people that have, they have a lot at stake in getting this business from you. They're going to make commission. They're going to hit their numbers, et cetera, et cetera. That's all fine. That's just the reality of the world. Nothing wrong with that yet so far, but it creates this human behavior dynamic that creates a lot of problems. Is you have two dynamics working here. You've got a sales rep who's overzealous to get the deal done and get the deal closed. You've got a system integrator who wants to get their people staffed up as fast as possible because that's immediate revenue for them, and they're speeding up their own revenue. And then over on the client side internally, you have a project team that's pretty excited. Now you finally have the answer. You know what the answer is to fix our old crappy systems that everyone's tired of and wants to replace, that we've been talking about replacing for years now. Finally, we know what the answer is. We know we're going to implement vendor X. And so you've got the internal team who's excited, they're ready to go, they want to get started. And then you have the human nature of, I want something I can see, touch, and feel. And that is the software. I can't see and touch and feel business process change and change management and all the stuff that's going to make the project successful, but I can see and touch and feel software. So let's just dive into that. So you've got this congruence, or this emergence, or this series of events coming together in a perfect storm, where now we end up rushing into the project because now system integrator wants to bring on their big army of consultants. Vendor wants to sign the cloud subscription contract now. Internal team's excited, momentum's high. Let's keep riding that momentum. And now that's all comes together into let's just go. Let's just start designing and building stuff. We can see it and touch it and feel it. We can make progress. We can talk about how we're hitting our milestones. And every dynamic works against you when you think about phase 0 planning. But yet I would argue that's the most important part of the project. The most important phase of the project is phase 0. If you skip over phase 0 and rush into the project, I have trouble seeing a scenario where you could possibly succeed with any reasonable amount of probability, because you're going aimlessly. It's like someone just, someone took you on a plane ride and just threw you out, and you parachute down wherever you are, and they're asking you to get to California. You have no idea where you are, but you need to get to California, and let's just start going now. Instead of stopping to think, well, hold on, let's figure out where we are. Let's figure out what the terrain is we have to get through. Let's figure out what resources we're going to need to make this trek to California. Let's figure out are we in the right continent? Do we need to do we need another airplane? Do we need what's our means of transportation? To think of that analogy, that's a lot like what these projects are like. If you were lost in the desert and you're trying to figure out how to get home, you wouldn't just start walking aimlessly. If you had access to resources or you had time to stop and think, you would stop and think and say, okay, let me figure out what my plan is and how I'm going to do this. But too many organizations skip that. So phase zero is really critical and something that I think is finally becoming better understood in the industry just in the last few years, but it's still one that's severely underestimated. So that is phase zero. Another thing we haven't talked about, and I know we're running a little bit over time, but since I don't have a guest on today, if you're all able to keep listening, I'll keep talking and keep the conversation going for a few more minutes. But one of the things that we haven't talked a lot about, although we've alluded to it, is change management and just governance. So the people and organizational change side of things, as well as project governance. And so a lot of times you have to ask, steering committees meet regularly, but are they actually leading? Are they actually steering the project? And we see a lot of clients where they've got their monthly or their biweekly status report updates to the steering committee. And a lot of times it's a PowerPoint presentation that talks about how great everything is. Yeah, there's a couple of risks over here, but don't worry, they're under control. Overall project status is green. And then here's where we are with budget and timeline, and any questions. Okay, great. We're going to get back to work. It becomes a very routine, going through the motion sort of initiative when it comes to steering committee report outs. But I think it's up to the steering committees that are going through these projects. In many cases, they need to be more actively involved. They need to ask tougher questions. They need to ask, why is that project status report all green? That doesn't seem realistic. It is what I want to hear, but it doesn't seem realistic. That's the kind of question that steering committees need to ask and need to focus on, but yet they don't oftentimes. So having project governance in place to ensure the steering committee has visibility into not only challenges and risks, but also decisions we need from them. When it comes to major process changes, organizational changes, or even you think about AI, many of you are probably involved with AI initiatives in some way, whether it's part of an ERP project or broader digital transformation, or with many of our clients, we're seeing several of our clients right now that are only implementing AI technology on top of their existing tech stacks. So it could be an AI first or an AI focused transformation. It could be just AI as part of it, but chances are pretty high you're touching AI or considering AI as part of your transformation. But you think about that impact that's going to have to people. I mean, those are big impacts, and those are big decisions that leaders need to make and steering committees need to make around not only how we're going to use technology and what technologies we're going to use, but how are we going to provide governance to AI and other technologies? How are we going to change people's jobs as a result of these technologies? And how big of a change and disruption are we willing to take on as an organization? Those are leadership strategic issues. Those are not tech issues. Those are not issues that just the CIO or the project manager of the ERP project should be making. Those are things that should be escalated to a steering committee that says, here's what we think, here's what we recommend, but we need you, the steering committee, to decide and bless this, or tell us if we're off base and tell us what the right answer is. And a lot of times, for those of you that are listening that are not on a steering committee, but you're working with a steering committee, you might say, well, my steering committee would never do that. They would never, roll up their sleeves and get involved. And that's understandable. And that's an understandable frustration. And it's a very concerning frustration. But the easy answer to that would be to force it by saying, here are the things we need from you. Yes, you've delegated the project to us, but these are strategic leadership decisions that we need from you. And, here's what we recommend. Here's the pros and cons of each of the options. We recommend X, but you tell us what you think. Do you agree or not? And let's make that decision, move on. So I think it's incumbent on project teams, project managers, project teams, members, to push up a lot of this decision making. I'm not saying every single minute decision that needs to be made on a project should go to the steering committee, but there are many decisions that get made at too low of a level. And what ends up happening, even if it is the right answer, even if it's the best thing for the organization, and even if it's the same thing that the executive would have decided if you would have asked them, that may be very, very well true, and it may be very well true a majority of the time. But when they don't have ownership of that, when something goes wrong, the bullseye shifts to you, whether you're the project manager, or the executive sponsor, or project team member. And so a way to do that, and this is just more of a CYA career sort of advice, more than just how to be successful in a project. a COIA mechanism is to push that decision up and push that validation up the organization, because you want them to own that for your own personal self-preservation purposes, but also more importantly, for the good of the organization, you need the executive team making those decisions, validating them. So that's all important stuff for sure. I want to say hello to Ken joining from North Carolina. Lionel's joining from Switzerland. Thank you for being here today. And Carlos just had to jump off. Great discussion. Have a great day, all. Thank you for that. Question here from Sanjay on LinkedIn is, how do you define the change management and troubleshooting in growth mode projects in ERP systems and recovery stages? Well, there's a lot you can do in terms of change management. In fact, if you go to our website, we have a guide to organizational change management. If I have the QR code, I'll drop it here, but I do not have it here on this platform right this second. But if you go to the third stage consulting.com and go to the resource center, go to guides and reports, you'll see a guide to organizational change management in there. You can also just go to our website and search guide to change management, and it should pull up that resource that you can get on our website. That download will give you a lot of good guidance on steps in the change management process. So thank you for that great question. And then just the last thing I'll talk about here today that we haven't gotten to, there's a lot we haven't gotten to. I have not gotten through the entire top 10 list, which I could have guessed that would happen here today, given the meatiness of this discussion. But just a couple things I'll run through in sort of a lightning round. Unrealistic expectations we talked about earlier, but that is in my top 10 list, not having realistic expectations around what this project will look like. And a subcategory of unrealistic expectations would be bad success metrics. So not having clear definitions and measures for what success looks like. That's another common challenge we see. And then another thing is normalizing failure and ignoring warning signs. There's so many reasons why these projects and human behavior, organizational behavior lead us to false green status reports. A lot of it is because a lot of it's self-preservation. We as humans we tend to be biased towards the quality of work we're doing. And if I'm a project manager, I might err on the side of optimism when I'm rating the success of the team. So I might be giving a green status to something that maybe is yellow or maybe green, or amber or green, I should say, just to go with the red, amber, green nomenclature for those of you that follow that. But regardless, I think that's partially part of it is that self-reporting bias, but then also you get the software vendor and system integrators who are doing the same thing. They'll say everything's fine, so it's green, partially for the same reason, because they're grading their own homework, so they're giving themselves an A, even if they should be getting a C, D, F, or whatever. And so they give you that input as project manager, and you say, okay, great. Vendor says it's green. I'm going to report green up to the staff, to the steering committee. And you can see how risk gets overlooked very easily, because you've got a group of people that are acting out of self-preservation. In the case of the vendor, they're acting in self-interest in terms of they want to preserve this cash cow they've built with the revenue from the services they built by having this army of people on the team. So they've got a lot to lose by saying, oh, actually, we're doing a crap job. Funny you should ask. Yeah, we suck. This the work we're doing is awful, and the output's just terrible, and you guys are likely to fail, but let's just keep going. They're not going to say that, even if that's true, even if there are failure points and things percolating under the surface, which there always are. And when I say always, I mean always. There are always risks percolating under the surface. And if you have a vendor or a partner who's telling you everything is fine, then you've got a problem with that partner, because no matter who it is, you do have problems. And there's always, it's like that game Whack-A-Mole. If any of you are old enough to remember, I don't even know if that game's still around. Maybe it is still around, but the game where the moles pop up and you have to take the little hammer thing and hit the mole, but then another one pops up somewhere else. You just keep going and see how many moles you can hit in that arcade game. That is a lot like risk management in these projects. You might solve one risk, but then another one's going to pop up later. And I'm not saying this to be a overly pessimistic person. It's the reality of change. It's the reality of complexity of digital transformations in ERP projects. It's just the nature of the beast. So instead of pretending like the project's going to be fine and easy, why not just go in with the assumption it's going to be hard, and let's prepare for that. Let's act logically work around that. So I think having clarity around what those risks are, and just ensuring that we are realistic about it. And the good thing about risk management, and let's just say you have a risk log of 100 things, and it may seem overwhelming, and you may think, oh no, I can't report that because that makes me look bad. Well, it's not a bad thing if you've identified them and you have a strategy and a plan to address them. And if you have 100 of them, it may be that, yeah, we've got 100 risks, 80 of them are just low to moderate risk, but these 10 or 20 are high risks or high impact, and we've got a strategy to deal with those. Then prioritize and focus on the highest risk ones. You may not be able to solve all the problems, but you can at least deal with the highest risk ones. And so having that deliberate, logical, structured conversation around risks and how we're going to mitigate the risks and how we're going to prioritize the risks, that's all super important stuff too. And so I guess I would just leave you with this. So what should executives do differently? And I guess I'd love to hear in the chat, if you don't mind dropping in the chat here, if you had to pick one thing that executives should stop doing or start doing to make their projects less likely to succeed, what would you say it is? Love to hear your feedback here in the chat. And by the way, I'm trying to get a lot of feedback from you all because you're giving me ideas for YouTube videos. So I have my own selfish reasons for asking these questions too, in addition to the fact that it's just good feedback from you all. So that'd be a question for you. What's the one thing executives must stop, and what should they start and do more of? Love to hear your thoughts on that. And if you're leading an ERP project right now, I'd love to hear the one truth that what's the one uncomfortable truth that you're avoiding. Hopefully you've learned some stuff here today in today's conversation and hearing from other people too. But I'd love to hear if there's if there's one thing that you take away from this that you feel like, okay, I can apply this to my project now. And then I just saw this comment come in on YouTube, which is a good one. It's a good capstone comment here. And it's a quote from someone else. The quote is, "It's a lot easier to fix the score than fix the store." And that's from Jim Womack from Gemba Walks. I'm not familiar with that. I don't know what that is. Is that a book, I assume? Or is it a movie? I'm not sure. But it's a lot easier to fix the score than to fix the store. Interesting point. So thank you for that. And so I guess the takeaway here is that ERP failure is not inevitable. But avoiding it requires a certain amount of leadership, courage, and in many cases, uncomfortable decisions. And what I also want to leave you with is, if you want to download our ERP recovery guide, be sure to check that out. And again, this is not just for people that might be failing or in a failure right now. It might be that you're just trying to identify what the risks are. It may be that you're having some problems, you're hitting some turbulence in your project. Ideally, read this guide before you get too far down the path. It's something that will help you avoid failure, or at least catch the failure or catch the risks and address those risks now. But check out that recovery guide on our website. Let me know what you think once you have a chance to look at it. And be sure to follow me if you're watching on YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, wherever you are. Be sure to follow me if you don't already. We do these live streams every week. It'll become part of our weekly Transformation Ground Control podcast. So we're going to add some additional content. We'll edit this up, clean it up, make it look pretty, and make it part of a formal podcast episode that comes out next week called Transformation Ground Control. And those podcast episodes are released every Wednesday. So go to transformationgroundcontrol.com if you'd like to learn more about that podcast. If you'd like to see more discussions like this one, you can find that there as well. So be sure to follow me. You can watch this replay here on whatever platform you're watching. It'll be available for you. And be sure to download the Project Recovery Guide. And if you have any comments or ideas for future topics for this podcast, I'd love to hear your feedback. So be sure to drop those in the chat as well. So thank you all for your time. Thank you for your great feedback and questions. Hope you all have a great week, and we'll see you next week. Same time, same place. We'll have a new topic, new guest, and